What if one photograph could rewrite an entire chapter of American history, not a forged image, not a staged reenactment, but a real, tangible artifact hidden in an attic for more than a century that, once revealed, sent shivers through some of the world's top historians. It began with something ordinary. An old trunk, brass latch dulled with time, leather straps worn nearly to threads, the kind of thing you'd find at a flea market, tucked under a table, holding nothing but dust and the smell of decades gone by. But this trunk had been in Clare Donovan's family home for as long as she could remember, sitting quietly in the attic like an old relative no one talked about. She hadn't meant to open it that day. In fact, she'd only dragged it down because she thought it might be worth cleaning up for decoration. But once she cracked it open, the air inside hit her like a whisper from the past, dry, musty, carrying faint traces of something sweeter, like old tobacco or dried flowers. Inside, folded lace gloves, letters brittle with age, a few railroad bonds, and buttons that had probably outlived the coats they once adorned. And then, tucked at the very bottom, was a small leather-bound photo album. The spine was cracked, the pages warped from years of neglect. Most of the images inside were faded sepia portraits of stiff-faced men and women. But one photograph sealed inside wax paper, as if it were dangerous, immediately caught her attention. It was thicker than the others, heavier. She could smell something odd even through the paper, a mix of glue and smoke. And when she finally slid it free, she stopped breathing, because staring back at her from that photograph was Abraham Lincoln, not the Lincoln of grainy black and white schoolbook portraits. This was Lincoln in full color, his black coat rich and textured, his face almost warm, his top hat sharp against a pale spring sky. To his left stood Ulysses S. Grant in full Union uniform, flanked by other officers. They all looked frozen mid-conversation, as if someone had pressed pause on April 1865. But that wasn't what made Clare's stomach twist. This color photograph shouldn't exist. Not in 1865. Not even close. And yet, here it was held in her trembling hands. Clare didn't know whether to be thrilled or terrified. She had no expertise in photography, no training in Civil War history, just a gut feeling that she was holding something no one had seen in over 100 years. The colors seemed impossible for the time. The uniforms shimmered in deep blues and grays. The wood grain of a nearby chair was so vivid she could almost feel it. Her first instinct was skepticism. Surely this was some later reproduction, a novelty item, maybe hand-tinted decades after the war. She almost set it aside. Almost. But the weight of the image, the way the pigment seemed fused into the paper, made her hesitate. It felt original. The problem was, Clare had no one in her circle who could verify it. She had friends who loved old antiques, a few who collected coins or stamps, but nothing on this level. So she reached out to the one person she knew with a reputation for knowing everything about Civil War photography, Professor George Kramer. Kramer had taught at SUNY Albany for nearly 2 decades, published 3 textbooks, and been quoted in countless documentaries. Clare remembered him from a few guest lectures back in college, meticulous, precise, and maybe a little intimidating. She didn't expect him to reply quickly. But when she sent him a few carefully lit photos of the image, his response came in less than 2 minutes. "Where did you find this? I need to see it now." When she told him it came from her family's attic, his reply was short. "Don't move it. I'm coming over." When he arrived, Kramer didn't waste time on pleasantries. He barely blinked as she unwrapped the photo from its wax paper. He leaned so close she could see his reflection in the glossy surface. "This," he muttered, almost to himself, shouldn't exist. Claire felt her pulse quicken. So, it's fake. Kramer shook his head slowly, eyes still locked on the print. That's what's terrifying. It's not fake. And if it's real, this could change the visual history of the Civil War. He explained in clipped, urgent phrases. Color emulsions weren't even theorized until decades after the war. The paper stock, known as Albayman silver print, dated to the 1860s and couldn't hold chromogenic dyes. And yet, here it was, an image with pigments seemingly embedded into the fibers themselves. Claire didn't know whether to smile or panic. She'd stumbled onto something extraordinary and dangerous. The expert's shockrammer didn't waste a second. Within minutes of confirming the photo wasn't a crude reproduction, he was already making calls. His voice was low but urgent, speaking in the clipped jargon of someone who had just stumbled across a once-in-a-lifetime find. The next morning, Claire found herself walking through the quiet marble halls of the New York Historical Society, clutching a slim acid-free case against her chest. Inside was the photograph, still sealed in its original wax sleeve. She trailed behind Kramer like a nervous student on her way to an exam. In the archives room, a small team was already assembled. People who looked like they spent their lives working in climate-controlled vaults. There was Dr. Ilse Turnbaum, a forensic imaging expert with the calm, precise movements of a surgeon, and Mason Lee, a paper conservator whose specialty was 19th-century documents. When Elsa opened the sleeve, the tension in the room thickened. She didn't just glance at the image, she studied it like it might vanish if she blinked too fast. Without a word, she slid it under a high-resolution scanner. The screen lit up, and Claire caught her breath. Every detail was sharper than she'd seen at home. The folds in Lincoln's coat, the slight dust on the officer's boots, even the carved grain of the wooden chair beside him. The colors weren't garish or obviously painted, they were subtle, natural, embedded. This, Elsa murmured, isn't hand-colored. The pigments are inside the emulsion, not layered on top. That's impossible, Mason said without looking away from the screen. Elsa shook her head. It's not supposed to exist, but it does. These colors are embedded like early Kodachrome, except that process wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. Claire's stomach tightened. So, you're saying this photo really could have been taken during the Civil War? Elsa's fingers hovered over the scanner controls. If the paper stock is authentic and from the early readings, it is, then yes, this image is from the 1860s. She paused, eyes narrowing. And if the date lines up, it might have been taken in the final days of the war, possibly even during Lee's surrender. Claire didn't speak. She couldn't. All she could do was watch as they began scanning deeper, peeling back layers of information the human eye could never catch. Each line of data made the impossible seem more real, but the deeper they looked, the stranger it got. The mysterious mon as the lab's analysis continued. Claire opened her laptop and began using a side-by-side archive tool, matching each face in the photograph to known Civil War officers. Grant was easy, his stern expression and neatly trimmed beard matched countless historical portraits. General Meade was just as straightforward. A few others required digging through lesser-known regimental archives, but eventually, the identities began to click into place. Then she stopped. Her cursor hovered over a man positioned directly between Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. He was slimmer than the generals, his uniform crisp but lacking the heavy decoration of higher command. His eyes were sharp, his stance almost watchful. There was no name for him in the known rosters, no corresponding photograph in the archives, but Claire knew that face. She quickly pulled up a scanned copy of a Donovan family photograph from 1912, an image she'd seen countless times growing up. In it, an older man stood beside a weathered barn, holding a dog. The jawline was identical, the sloped eyebrows, the distinct curve of the ears. It was uncanny. "That's him," she whispered. Kramer leaned over her shoulder. "Who?" "My great-great-grandfather, William Donovan." She tapped the Civil War portrait on the screen. "Look, the same bone structure, even the same faint scar above the eyebrow." Kramer's expression hardened. "That's impossible. Official records say a William Donovan, medic with the 104th New York Infantry, went missing in action on April 6, 1865, 3 days before this photo would have been taken." Claire scrolled through the old family records her grandfather had kept. He wasn't missing. He was standing right there, beside Lincoln, the week the war ended. The room fell into an easy silence. If this was true, then Donovan hadn't simply been a medic lost to the chaos of war. He'd been placed deliberately beside the president at a pivotal moment in American history. But why? Hidden records Kramer wasn't the kind of historian who trusted family lore or uncanny resemblances alone. If William Donovan had really been there, standing beside Lincoln, there had to be a record somewhere, something buried in the archives that had been overlooked for more than a century. He stepped over to a terminal in the corner of the room, logged into a restricted database, and began pulling up War Department files. Most were tedious supply orders, field promotions, casualty lists. But then, halfway down a list of April 1865 field notes, a single line made him stop cold. "WD moved to Shadow Post per Al's request. Not to be logged. No weapons drawn unless required." Kramer read it twice before speaking. "This is unusual. No official orders, no commanding officer listed, just a transfer, and an instruction not to record it in the main roster." Claire leaned over his shoulder. "Al's request." "Al," Kramer said quietly, "was a shorthand some aides used for the president himself, Abraham Lincoln. Which means your great-great-grandfather was personally reassigned by Lincoln just days before the war ended." He turned back to the monitor. "It's not a combat role. Shadow Post wasn't an official designation. It's something you'd use for an escort, a messenger, or someone placed in a sensitive position without drawing attention." Elsa spoke up from across the room. "So not missing in action, hidden in action." Claire felt a chill spread through her. If William Donovan had been handpicked by Lincoln, it wasn't random. He'd been trusted enough to stand within arm's reach of the president at one of the most politically volatile moments in U.S. history. And yet, no one in the family had ever spoken of it, which raised an unsettling question. If Donovan had been so trusted, why had he vanished from the historical record altogether? The badge and the message. While Kramer and Claire dug through documents, Elsa continued working on the high-resolution scans. She'd been methodically examining each uniform, insignia, and shadow for anomalies when something on Donovan's jacket caught her eye. "Hold on," she said, her voice breaking the room's quiet. "There's something sewn into his lapel." Everyone gathered round the monitor as she zoomed in. At first it looked like a fold in the fabric, but as she sharpened the image, tiny stitches emerged, faint but deliberate. It was a badge, barely the size of a fingernail, hidden just beneath the officer's collar. The embroidery formed 3 letters. P.C. Kramer's eyes widened. "Presidential Escort Committee." His voice trailed off. "But that doesn't exist. Not in any official records from 1865. Elsa nodded slowly. "Which means it was either an entirely secret designation, or something they never intended to survive in the historical record. Before anyone could respond, she adjusted the color spectrum on the skin and frowned. Wait, there's more. Directly below the badge, stitched so faintly it was almost invisible, was a second line of thread. Elsa enhanced it until the letters came into view. Target verified. Stand until April 14th. The room went still. Claire's breath caught in her throat. April 14th, the night Lincoln was assassinated. No one spoke for several seconds. The hum of the scanner seemed suddenly deafening. Are you suggesting? Mason finally began, but stopped when Kramer shook his head. I'm not suggesting anything, Kramer said grimly. But if that message is authentic. Donovan knew there was a target and that something was expected to happen that night. Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. So he wasn't just standing there as a god. He might have been trying to stop something. Or, she couldn't finish the thought. The possibility that her ancestor had either failed to prevent the assassination or had been silenced before he could act was almost too much to process. The hidden letter. For days after the discovery of the lapel message, Claire couldn't stop thinking about it. The words burned in her mind. Target verified. Stand until April 14th. It was both a command and a countdown. And she couldn't help but wonder if her great-great-grandfather had known exactly what was coming. The photograph was now locked in a climate-controlled vault at the New York Historical Society. But Claire still had the old leather album it came from, a crumbling relic she hadn't examined fully in her rush to get the photo to Kramer. One quiet evening, she laid the album out on her kitchen table. The cracked spine groaned as she opened it, the air filling with the faint scent of dust and brittle paper. She turned the stiff pages slowly, scanning each pocket for any sign of hidden material. Halfway through, her fingers brushed something unusual, a faint bulge behind a photo slot. She carefully loosened the corner of the deteriorating cardboard, and an envelope slid free. It was weathered and yellowed with age, its flap unsealed. On the front, in a strong, deliberate hand, was written, "To William, from Al." Her heart hammered as she slipped on cotton gloves and removed the single sheet of paper inside. The ink had faded but was still legible. Dated April 10, 1865, just 4 days before Lincoln's assassination, it read, "My dear William, if this war has taught us anything, it is that truth rarely survives the men who need it most. You were not chosen to draw your sword, but to stand visible among the ones who do. What we do with peace will test us more than what we did with war. So stand where they don't expect you. Watch who you must. And if history forgets you, let them. I won't." Claire's throat tightened. She read it again, slow this time, letting each word sink in. This wasn't a formal military order, it was personal. Lincoln had trusted William enough to place him where no one else even knew he was standing, to be his eyes in a moment when the war's end didn't necessarily mean safety. And Lincoln had known that history might erase William's role entirely. Claire sat back in her chair, staring at the letter, realizing for the first time that the photograph wasn't just a rare Civil War artifact, it was the only surviving piece of evidence of a silent, hidden duty that her great-great-grandfather had carried to his grave. The man who stood anyway unveiling drew a small crowd, but to Claire, it felt monumental. The exhibit stood quietly in one corner of the New York Historical Society. No flashing lights, no dramatic fanfare, just a replica of the photograph, perfectly preserved, a brief biography of William Donovan, and a quote from the letter Lincoln had written to him. Above the display, etched in clean lettering, were the words, "Some men fight with swords, others With silence, visitors lingered longer than Clare expected. Some leaned close to study the details in the image, the tension in Lincoln's shoulders, the unreadable gaze of Grant, the calm watchfulness of the unknown man standing between them. Others read the placard twice, as if trying to fit Donovan into the version of history they thought they knew. Clare didn't correct anyone. She didn't tell them how the badge had been hidden, or what the stitched message meant. She didn't speculate about whether William had known the danger Lincoln faced, or how close he might have come to preventing it. Some things, she realized, didn't need answers to carry weight. For over a century, William Donovan had been a ghost in the family's past, the one who disappeared. Now, his silence had its place in the light, and Clare knew that if her great-great-grandfather had stood there and seen, watching over Lincoln in those final days, he hadn't been forgotten after all. In the end, all it took was someone willing to look closer. So maybe the question wasn't whether one photograph could rewrite history. Maybe it was whether we'd ever have the courage to truly see what it's been showing us all along.